So welcome, and what a nice turnout for a Friday afternoon. I'm just more than happy. I know Dan's more than happy as well. And I think we can thank the Catholic Information Center for helping push the numbers. So we really appreciate you coming out. And I think you're going to really enjoy the program today. I'm Bob Williams, the academic director here at Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And while you're here, you know, the first 30 minutes, you got some good food, and in the last 30 minutes, will be good food and book signing. But take the opportunity to, you know, look at the museum. We just stood up a couple of weeks ago, a temporary exhibit from Dissident to President from Václav Havel. We were able to meet Elizabeth, and Dan went and was able to tour through that. You'd be very impressed. So we're highly privileged today to have Daniel J. Mahoney with us, and who's going to discuss the memoirs of Cardinal József Mindszenty. Daniel is a conservative scholar, public and intellectual, acclaimed author, and trustee at National Review Institute. He's written on French politics and political thought, and has also written extensively on Alexander Solzhenitsyn and the moral grounds of opposition to totalitarianism. I have to bring this one out. So recently, the National Review had an article penned by Jack Fowler. Do you remember Jack Fowler, Dan?
I know Jack Fowler very well.
Yes, and it was titled Mahoney Wins. So when I looked at it, I go, I hope this isn't a Dewey win story. So some of you will get that. So in the article, Jack remembers Dan as a close friend for 4 decades, dating back to time at College of the Holy Cross, where he specifically mentions gallivanting around, which is what I'd like to share some of those stories at some point later with you. So what did he win? So Daniel's 2022 book, The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation. Exactly what did he win? The prestigious Intercollegiate Studies Institute Palucci Award for Conservative Book of the Year. So I think a round of applause and kudos to Dan for winning that, right? So it's a tradition to honor these books, and it's the most significant contribution to conservative canon that rightly describes the statement as thinker. I second Jack's kudos to Dan, and that's an outstanding achievement, and I know you're proud, and you should be. So, but today Dan is here for another book. This is the book, and you'll have an opportunity later to, as you're moving around the museum, to purchase the book, and it'll be a book signing. It'll be like the latter part of the program. And Dan's introduction in this book, titled Remembering a Hungarian Patriot and a Man of Heroic Christian Virtue, it's very thought-provoking. And I would say, along with the foreword by Joseph Pearce, those two pieces provide a very excellent lead into the Cardinal's memoirs. So I read those. So with no further ado, I'm going to present you Daniel J. Mahoney.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just pull a few things out before I begin. Perhaps I should say something about the genesis of this particular edition, which was officially released, edition of Cardinal Mindszenty's memoirs, which was officially released on March 5th of this year by Ignatius Press, which is a really first-rate Catholic press, probably I think the best Catholic publishing house in the United States, directed by Father Fezio, who was a student of Pope Benedict XVI, and publishes a list that I think is really worthy of the best Catholic intelligence. You know, books on serious philosophy, theology, culture, current events, but always from a perspective that is dedicated to the defending the well springs of Western and Christian civilization And I'll tell you just a little bit about how this edition came to be. Cardinal Mindszenty was once a very famous man. An interviewer with the Catholic World Report asked me not so long ago, well, how come Mindszenty is less famous than Cardinal Stepanich and Votiva? And I said, oh, at a certain time, he was much more famous than all of them combined. At a time when Time magazine was the news weekly of record, Cardinal Mindszenty was on the cover of Time magazine, and there were many schools in the United States and England, Australia, and elsewhere that were named after Cardinal Mindszenty. When Cardinal Mindszenty was arrested and subject to a show trial in January and February 1949, there were mass demonstrations all over the world, from Dublin, that used to be the capital of a Catholic country called Ireland, in Paris, which used to be a Catholic country, in Rome. Pope Pius XII spoke out very eloquently, and Mindszenty was the subject, I think, of great admiration from many American Catholics. And of course, Mindszenty's imprisonment for 8 years he was arrested for the third time. We'll get to all of that on December 26, 1948, when the communist dictatorship was, you might say, it was complete. After all the opposition parties had been crushed, all that was left was Cardinal Mindszenty, who had more or less was the spokesman for the Hungarian nation in 1947 and 1948. He had very little power. Remember the famous remark of Stalin, how many divisions does the Pope have? Some, but spiritual divisions, unarmed prophets, as Machiavelli said. But Cardinal Mindszenty declared 1948 to be a Marian year. And so he traveled all around Hungary. There were crowds, 500,000, 1 million people praying. Cardinal Mindszenty once said, I will never lose hope for Hungary as long as 1 million people are praying. So, and Mindszenty was also under the old Hungarian constitution. He was the Prince Primate, the Archbishop of Esztergom, and that meant he had a certain constitutional responsibility. He saw himself as the leader of the Hungarian nation during the period of communist captivity. This is sort of an old-fashioned view. Mindszenty never really accepted the legitimacy of the Hungarian People's Republic, which was established in 1946. So in any case, Mindszenty was quite famous. He was remembered, subject of many books and articles during his captivity from 1948, his imprisonment until 1956. He was liberated at the beginning of November of 1956 during the quasi-miraculous Hungarian uprising or Hungarian Revolution. He spoke to the Hungarian nation by radio on November 3rd, 1956. It's really his biographer, Margit Balog, a wonderful biography, by the way, which is available, somewhat abridged at 800 pages, from a paperback from Catholic University Press, a book called A Victim of History. I'll tell you a little bit about what that phrase means a little bit later. But he gave a wonderful speech about the restoration of the national soul. And he said, look, we need to move forward, with in decency, morality, and liberty. And of course, he said that the Catholic Church's schools and newspapers and all that needed to be restored. One of the last acts of nationalization in 1948 was the takeover of the Catholic school system, which made enforced political indoctrination much more possible. But it's really interesting, after János Kadar and the Soviets, Hungarian communist regime crushed the uprising. János Kadar was with the revolution until he wasn't with it. The this legend developed that Mindszenty had spoken about the restoration of the church's lands and that he represented neo-fascist and anti-Semitic reaction. None of that was true. As Margit Balog says in her wonderful biography, he spoke with balance and decency, and he spoke the common sense of the matter in 1956. And the fact that an old communist like Najim Ranaj and was welcoming the liberation of Mindszenty was really a sign of how far Hungary had come during those miraculous days. And of course, on November 4th, 1956, Cardinal Mindszenty went to the American legation before it became an embassy, and he would remain there for 15 years, and I'll talk more about that later. But he was still somewhat in the public eye during that period. He certainly was the leader in the Catholic world in East Central Europe who was most associated with uncompromising, intransigent opposition to communist totalitarians. Wyszynski and Wojtyła were pretty uncompromising when it came to communist ideology, but since the church was stronger, they were in a position in Poland to sort of deal with the regime from at least not a position of absolute weakness. The situation in Hungary was very, very different. It would remain very different until the fall of the Hungarian People's Republic at the end of 1989. In any case, Mindszenty's memoirs were initially published in 1974. And when he was in the West, the final period of Mindszenty's life, I'm really jumping ahead and I'm going to go back, but the final period of Mindszenty's life was 1971, 1975. There was sort of a 1-2 pincer movement. President Richard Nixon in Washington and Pope Paul VI in Rome. They wanted Mindszenty to leave the embassy. The Americans wanted better relations with the Hungarians. This was in the midst of the détente policy, heralded and pushed by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and President Richard M. Nixon. And it was also the period of Ostpolitik, Cardinal Casaroli, the Vatican Secretary of State, who thought he could make deals with all of the communist regimes that would somehow improve the position of the church. Well, I think that was largely a misguided policy and judgment. You know, it's one thing to have concordates with Bismarck or, run-of-the-mill authoritarian regimes who have limited ideological ambitions. But the idea of some kind of, I think the church made a mistake in 1933 with the concordat with Nazi Germany. Never worked. It never could work. And, but in any case, Mindszenty went into exile. And I think the thing that, he didn't hesitate to criticize Paul VI of the church for its misguided détente policy. He refused to cover up the nature of communism, simply constitutionally incapable of doing so, as a faithful Catholic and as a Hungarian patriot. But I think Nixon and Paul VI were able to get Mindszenty out of the embassy and come to the West because they held out the promise that he could publish his memoirs, the book we have before us today. By the way, initially, the memoirs were much, much bigger. And Mindszenty originally envisioned a 10-volume work that included a kind of political, cultural, and spiritual history of Hungary. And that was reconsidered in light of the nature of the reading public, and too much on the Treaty of Trianon of 1919 may have interested Hungarian patriots. Hungary lost much of its population and land in 1919. The head of Hungary for much of that period between the end of the First World War and his overthrow by the Nazis in 1944, Admiral Horthy, he was an admiral in a landlocked country without a navy, you know? And by the way, I think not a terrible man, a patriot, a Calvinist, a man, I think, who did his best in a very difficult circumstance. Luckily, he made it to Portugal, where he died in 1957 or 8. But in any case, so this Mindszenty came to the West. He ministered to Hungarians all over the world. He went to Australia. He went to Venezuela. He went to South Africa. He went to England. He went to Germany. He went to France. And he came to the United States, where there was a lot of 56ers, families of people who had fled after the revolution. I remember him going to Cleveland when I lived there, because there was a big Hungarian population in Cleveland. He went to New Brunswick, New Jersey. He visited the Cistercians at University of Dallas. He went to St. Louis, where Phyllis Schlafly's sister-in-law had founded the Cardinal Mindszenty Foundation. He spoke out against moral decay in the West. He was deeply disturbed by the widespread use of abortion in the Eastern Bloc, but also the liberalization of abortion in the West. He did not hesitate to criticize what he saw as the growing ideological sympathy for not just dialogue with Marxism, Leninism, but the mistaken view of liberationists and others that the church could make its ideological peace with communism. And he made very clear to the Pope and others that he was going to tell the truth in his memoirs. The Cardinal regime was going crazy. They wanted the Vatican to silence Mindszenty. And in 1973, I don't know if they did this on purpose, but it was a moral travesty. Paul VI announced that Mindszenty would no longer exercise the office of Archbishop of Esztergom and Primate of Poland, although his position was not filled at the moment. And even more shockingly, Pope Paul VI, who had carried a cross in a great demonstration in Milan in November 1956 in solidarity with the Hungarians, he announced that Cardinal Mindszenty was not a victim of communism. He was a victim of history. And he lifted the excommunication against all those who had participated in his arrest, imprisonment, interrogation, and torture. Well, János Kádár, who was the then General Secretary of the Hungarian Communist Party and leader of the Hungarian People's Republic. You run for the hills when you hear People's Republic or the German Democratic Republic. But in any case, János Kádár was Minister of Interior. You know, he was in charge of the whole operation in 1948 and 49. Mindszenty's memoirs were published shortly thereafter in 1974. He died in 1975. His book was published to some acclaim in all major European countries and in some non-European countries. In America, the book got some attention, certainly among serious Catholics and anti-communists or anti-totalitarians. But Macmillan, his publisher, was in the middle of being gobbled up by another publishing company, you know, these gargantuan publishing houses in New York, and they fired half of their staff. So they didn't do very much to keep the book in print. It was in print for 2, 3, 4 years and went out of print. And although I would say, and I'm going to talk more about the memoirs, things did begin to change for Mindszenty when Karol Wojtyła, the Archbishop of Krakow, Poland, became Pope in 1978, in the fall of 78. Votiva had great respect for Mindszenty. So there's two beautiful pictures of Pope John Paul II praying at Mindszenty's tomb in Mariel in Austria in the fall of '88, and again after Cardinal Mindszenty was reburied in the cathedral at Esztergom. I believe that was 91, but I think John Paul II prayed there again in 1992. So, but the memoirs were out of print from 1977 on. Then something happened, and that event that happened was the rather unexpected announcement on the 2nd of February 2019 that that was the day that Pope Francis announced. Pope Francis is not particularly lucid on the subject of communist totalitarianism, if you haven't noticed. The NPR correspondent Sylvia Poggioli asked Pope Francis on the plane from Havana to Washington in 2015 if when he met with Fidel for 3 hours, did they discuss the terrible oppression that the church still faced? And he said, oh, no, we talked about ecology. Fidel cares about nature. So this is silliness. And the Pope didn't criticize the persecution of the Nicaraguan church until this April. Again, there's and we know that the head of the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences, an Argentinian buddy of Bishop buddy of Pope Francis, proclaimed 4 years ago that Catholic social thought, you remember liberty, human dignity, subsidiarity, religious liberty, anti-totalitarianism, was best instantiated in the People's Republic of China. Okay, so it was a bit of a surprise in February 2nd, 2019. It was announced that Cardinal John Henry Newman would be canonized in the fall, and Joseph Mindszenty would be made venerable for his heroic Christian virtue. A first step on the road, we hope, to eventual canonization. The spirit of Cardinal Mindszenty is not one, I think, really appreciated by those around the present pontificate, in large part because they're a little weak on Marxist ideology, and they tend to identify Christianity with humanitarianism, globalism, the UN, the world, pacifism, this kind of thing. Mindszenty was as much a Hungarian patriot as he was an undyingly faithful Catholic. That model of deep patriotism and deep Catholic faith is alien to the bien-pensant in the contemporary intellectual world and in certain parts of the Catholic Church. So anyway, when that happened, I wrote an article for Bob Royal's excellent daily posting called The Catholic Thing. And then John O'Sullivan, who runs the Danube Institute in Budapest, asked me to write a much longer piece on Mindszenty for the Hungarian Review. And a year or so later, it dawned on me that we need to bring the memoirs back into print, because I think the memoir is the testimony of a deep man of faith, a man who loved his country, not the false ideology that had come to dominate it and curse it, with all his heart. He was a civilized European. He was a man who believed in what he called eternal verities in the moral law. You know, when the Arrow Cross government, the Hungarian Nazis who took over after Admiral Horthy, the head of the Navy, the regent without a navy, without land, without water, yeah, that man. When he finally told Hitler that we're going to stop the deportations of the Jews that have been imposed on the Hungarians, tremendous pressure by the Germans, They, of course, deposed Horthy and replaced him by the Arrow Cross. But as early as 1937, Mindszenty had very eloquently and firmly denounced the Arrow Cross. He thought he had studied the writings of Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi racialist. He thought that kind of racialism, that thought, as Mindszenty said in a speech in 1944, the Ten Commandments apply to everyone. You can't murder Jews. You can't send people to death camps. You can't steal their property. You can't be a Christian and selectively violate 4 or 5 of the commandments. And as Margie Balog says in Victim of History, in a climate of real ideological anti-Semitism and fear, those were very courageous remarks, just reminding people that those kinds of actions were incompatible not only with the Christian faith and moral law, but with human decency. A couple of other things about Mindszenty. So I approached Ignatius. They thought it was a wonderful idea. I approached Joe Pierce because he's got a huge audience and is really good at pushing these kinds of things. And Joe told me, Joe has written a book on Solzhenitsyn, as I have, and he told me that not only were the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, but the memoirs of Cardinal Mindszenty had played a major role in his own conversion. So we approached Mark Broomley and Father Fessio at Ignatius Press, and the rest is history. So, and I'm so happy we've done this, because this is not just a pro forma act to honor a heroic man. This memoir, very honestly written, is the testimony of a great soul, a great man of faith and fidelity, and one of the anti-totalitarian titans of the 20th century. If I can have some notes here, I want to read. By the way, Mindszenty was first arrested by a liberal socialist government headed by Mihai Károlyi in 1919. And then he was thrown in the jail again by Bela Kun and the Hungarian Bolsheviks in 1919. He was arrested again in the fall of 1944 by the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian Nazis. And then he was arrested again by the Hungarian communists on St. Stephen's Day, the day after Christmas, December 26, 1948. So that's a lot of arrests over very many years. And Mindszenty didn't go looking for trouble, but he was a man of the utmost moral integrity. And I think that really forbade him from compromising on any essential matters. All right. If I can get here I am. I want to read a quotation from you, to you from 1948. You have to understand, in Hungary, there was the Red Army occupied the country. I learned recently when I was at the House of Terror in Budapest. The House of Terror is probably the best monument to totalitarian repression, the best work of education in that area, anywhere in the world. It's at 60 Andrassy Street, which is a great boulevard in Pest. It was the headquarters of the Arrow Cross, where they did their diabolical works. It then became the headquarters of the AVO, the Hungarian secret police. And it's been turned since 2002 into a great museum that aims to educate not only tourists, but the Hungarian people, young people, about exactly what was at stake in 20th century totalitarianism. And it's really an incredible, you walk in, you see hundreds and hundreds of pictures of young men and some women who were executed between 56 and 58 after the repression of the Hungarian uprising. But in 45, there was a election in Hungary. And it wasn't about 700,000 Hungarians had been deported. Many of them were Swabians, Germans, descent, terribly treated, just like the people in Sudetenland were terribly treated in Czechoslovakia, most of whom never returned. You had the Red Army occupying, you had an Allied Control Commission that did nothing. And even though the communists only won 17% of the vote, they controlled the Ministry of the Interior. And in Matteo Sarkozy's famous phrase, they used salami tactics to break up the opposition. They still lost the election of 1947, but they just accused the Prime Minister, Ferenc Nagy, of treason in April of 47. They ran the government, and there was Mindszenty and the Catholic Church. So this is from this time period where Mindzenty's really standing alone. And he's summarizing his thinking at this time. And this really, as much as any passage in the memoirs, captures his mind, his heart, and his soul. Both Nazism and Bolshevism, this is page 124 in our edition, insisted they had to penetrate our country in order to replace a faulty past by a happy new world. The communists, in keeping with their doctrine, announced that the past had to be uncompromisingly liquidated. It was in response to that prospects that I said in my installation address as Archbishop of Esztergom and Primate of Hungary, I wish to be the conscience of my people. As the appointed guardian, I knock upon the doors of your souls. Contrary to the errors that are now springing up, I proclaim to my people and my nation the eternal truths. I want to resurrect the sanctified tradition of our people. Individuals perhaps can live without it, but never the whole nation. This isn't what we in the Western world mean by democracy today. You know, we have the American ambassador, David Pressman, in Budapest. Every 3 days, he tweets how the Hungarian family policy is anti-democratic because it resists LGBTQI++. I is intersex, in case you're not up on the ever-expanding consonants in woke ideology, the gender theory. But Mindszenty represented an older view of political freedom, emphasizing its moral foundations, its ties with the Christian religion, its ties with the continuity of civilization, going back to the Greeks and the Bible, and its and the fact that Hungary ought to be a free nation, but a nation that is faithful to the baptism of Saint Stephen, the patron saint of Hungary, who brought the Hungarian people into the Catholic faith in around the end of the first millennium. Just one or two other remarks about Cardinal Mindszenty, because I know I'm going over my time. Cardinal Mindszenty was of a German background. He was born József Pehm, P-E-H-M. He deliberately, at a time when Hungary was falling under the German orbit during the war, he deliberately changed his name from a German name to a Hungarian name, and he renamed himself after the small village in the west of Hungary he was from, Mindszenty. So that says something, I think. It would have been much more convenient in the New Order to have a German name and to express solidarity with German racialism. That was not Mindszenty. There is no doubt that Cardinal Mindszenty was a conservative. He would not have liked LGBTQ++ ideology. He would not have wanted to see a world of nations replaced by l'humanité, global humanity. He was a man of traditional piety. Marquis Ballog, his best historian, calls him a plebeian conservative. He came from a peasant family. He was somebody who benefited from the educational opportunities offered to him by the church. And on a final note, let me say, it's very, very encouraging that Cardinal Erdo, the Cardinal Archbishop of Esztergom, has really dedicated the efforts of the Hungarian Church to support the canonization of Cardinal Mindszenty as a model of Christian fidelity, of Hungarian fidelity and patriotism, of deep fidelity to the moral law, and of what he was honored for on February 2nd, 2019, heroic Christian virtue. And we'll see, but it seems to me it's inevitable. Eventually, Mindszenty will be canonized. He will be a countercultural saint in the sense that his virtues are virtues of manliness, magnanimity, courage, determination. They're not the soft virtues. Can't we all get along? No. But there's much, and I will say this, when you go to Esztergom, to the great cathedral, about an hour from Budapest, you will see flowers and cards around Cardinal Mindszenty's tomb. You will see next to nothing around the tomb of Laszlo Lakay, his successor as Archbishop of Esztergom. Perhaps Lakay was trying to do his best, but he's so accommodated to the ideology of the Hungarian People's Republic. The church was so infiltrated by collaborators and peace priests that I think he crossed a line from trying to improve the fate of the church to sort of surrendering. And so Hungarians don't remember Lakay, probably, maybe unfairly, but Mindszenty is remembered. So there were some people in the 40s and 50s who said, oh, Cardinal Mindszenty was too intransigent. But in retrospect, the future lasts a long time, and we look back and we see courage where some of his contemporaries saw intransigence. I'll leave it on that note.
Thank you, Dan. And you pretty much answered all the questions that I had.
I have more to say. Don't worry.
In the interest of time, I'm going to just ask one question here from the podium. Then I'm going to turn it over so
Sure.
our audience to have the opportunity to ask several questions. In your introduction, you open with, not much good news coming out of Rome today. You go on to say the Franciscan Church is marked by immense moral and theological confusion and a tendency to kneel before the world. Which brings me to my question. And if the good Cardinal was still alive today, knowing what you sort of spoke to a little bit about this, knowing what you know about the man, what would you think his assessment of the current state of affairs of the Catholic Church would be?
Oh, I think there's no doubt he would be horrified. The idea that the fundamental moral teaching of the church this notion that the Holy Spirit is not the guardian of faith and moral integrity, but it's the spirit of what's happening now, the spirit of trans, the spirit of abortion, the spirit of gender 88 and gender 98. I think he would see that kind of accommodation. By the way, the term kneeling before the world comes from Jacques Maritain, the neo-Thomist Catholic philosopher and political philosopher, in his book, Le Paysan de la Garonne, which came out in English as The Peasant of the Garonne. It was published in 1966. And you have to understand, Maritain was once a very famous man. He was a leading Catholic intellectual in the world. He had been a big inspiration for the Second Vatican Council. But notice the date of this book, 1966. he was appalled by what was being done in the name of the Vatican Council. The cardinals in Rome refused to condemn communism, which many bishops wanted to reiterate the ideological condemnation of communism put forward by previous popes. There was, American said this week, what he meant by kneeling before the world was not a self-confident dialogue with modern currents, but a capitulation, where you're going to save the church and make it more influential by changing it, by historicizing it, by turning it into a vehicle for surrender to the zeitgeist. And in the Catholic world, that often went by the term the spirit of Vatican II. In other words, it wasn't what the Vatican Council itself said. It was this sort of leftist, progressivist appropriation of the conciliar documents, so I think it was really hard for Mindszenty. Remember, he came to the West in 71. And the America he knew, first of all, think of this. When Mindszenty went to become a cardinal in 1946, and he met Pius XII, and Pius XII said to him, you may be a martyr, but he spoke to all these men in Latin. Do you think any of these bishops can speak Latin today? Hell no. Secondly, he formed friendships with the Americans, Cardinal String in Chicago, Spellman in New York, and others, who gave a lot of aid to Hungary, which really needed it, Catholic Charities and other groups in the 1940s. And then, of course, the church was accused of collaboration with fascist forces because they were administrating much needed charity from the Catholic Church. And they were often using Western currency because the Hungarian currency was worthless. And that meant he was guilty of currency violations, but all carefully manipulated by the AVO and the party. So that was the America, early in his memoirs, he says, I look at America, this is the 50s and 60s, all those Catholic schools, those Catholic patriots. He saw a very traditional, self-confident American Catholic Church. And then I think when he came here in the 70s, he saw mass abortion, a loss of confidence, what you can only accurately describe as liturgical delirium, Sister Mary Elephant playing the guitar. I was born in 1960. I suffered through the liturgical delirium, and I think that must have all come as a bit of a shock to Mindszenty. And I also think the fact that so many people in positions of responsibility not only wanted to dialogue with the communist regimes, but they showed some sympathy for the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, the old Inquisition, but now it's just dedicated to propaganda in the legitimate sense, evangelization. They issued a statement in 1972 saying that Mao Zedong embodied evangelical virtues because he had done so much to feed the poor in China. But we know 40 million people died to death during the Great Leap Forward. This was ideological bunk. We had a priest at Holy Cross College where I went, Jesuit school. Jesuits were all crazy. Not everywhere, but at Holy Cross, they were all crazy. Father William Casey, who edited the Holy Cross Quarterly, proposed the canonization of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai after their deaths in 76 and 77 in the pages of the Holy Cross Quarterly. Again, on the idea that they were for the poor, for the proletariat, for the peasants and all this. So there was more than liturgical delirium. There was a great deal of intellectual confusion. You read the last volume of George Weigel's biography of the Pope, John Paul II. Vatican had tons of spies in it. KGB, Polish, Hungarian, and all of this. So it was a mess. So that had to be dispiriting. So Mindszenty spoke, I think, a message of hope to the Hungarian communities and others. He met with the West. He met many churchmen, Cardinal Heenan in London, who he greatly respected and admired. Cardinal Heenan said, as he introduced Cardinal Mindszenty, that before you start thinking communism is a good thing, remember Cardinal Mindszenty. There were men like that. But there was also much confusion. And, he ends his memoir after being dismissed from his position and with very powerful forces in the church trying to silence him so they could satisfy the desire of Kadar and his minions to keep Mindszenty quiet. Cardinal Mindszenty says, this is how I have arrived at total and complete exile. I don't know if that's a note of despair, but it's certainly a note of disappointment in his own church. So he died at a time when the church was overwrought, overcome by confusion. And then, a few years later, as George Weigel has chronicled in The Final Revolution, things did begin to change with Karol Wojtyła as Pope. But now we're back. Cardinal Parolin, with China, Nicaragua, and Cuba, is doing the same thing that Cardinal Casaroli did with East Europe in the 1970s. So, it's like a roller coaster, but the inability to learn any lessons from those previous mistakes is certainly unsettling.
We're going to open up to the audience. Have our young interns walking around with microphones, so please use those to ask your questions.
Thank you, sir. So I have a question about, you've mentioned Mindszenty offering a message of hope. One of the virtues that you signaled in his life was courage. So thinking about fortitude, not so much the courage to run out and be active, to do something, but to resist, to stand firm in the faith. I think back to early in Victim of History, the author is looking at a story when a woman is struggling in the local parish, and he goes as a young priest into a very cold, they don't have heat, a very cold church, and is able to be with the people. So he seems like this person that's maybe angry, but deep down is willing to suffer with his people. Can you speak to that virtue of fortitude in today's climate? Providentially, it's Feast of the Sacred Heart, so there's this act of reparation today. There's a bit of anti-Catholic sentiment in part of the culture. So for those of us looking to gain fortitude, how can you point out a couple examples in his life?
I would say, no, thank you for those remarks. I would say that Cardinal Mindszenty, and he could be cantankerous, but I think he was a very good and dignified man. He embodied what we used to call the cardinal virtues: courage, justice, prudence, moderation, temperance, and also the theological virtues. He had a deep, constant, and deep dedication to the Mother of God. And he wrote a book called The Mother in the 1920s, which is still in print in many languages. It's a Marian sort of inspired reflection on motherhood, but it's partly about Mary and partly about mothers. And but he saw the mother as as one of the great embodiments of love and perseverance and protection for the young and others alike. He carried a card in his, I don't know if it was a wallet exactly, but whatever he carried, it was a little card with Jesus with the criminal on the cross. This day you shall be with me in paradise. So in a unsophisticated way, I don't mean in a stupid way, but in a way, he had a simple faith, formed by a theological and philosophical and historical education. But I think you read the memoirs and you see this was a man who you couldn't break his soul. They broke him briefly in January 1949. He was tortured. If you go to the House of Terror, you can see the weapons that were used. He was beaten in his genitals by the rubber truncheons. He was kept up all night and day. He had to listen to ideological nonsense. His defense lawyer was an AVO agent, and he was beaten down. There is an issue. He is absolutely certain he was drugged. And I think he was drugged. Most of the Hungarian Mindszenty experts I speak to think he was drugged. But Margit Balog thinks, well, maybe not. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, he was beaten down. And as he says in his memoirs, he began to lose his personality. But he had the good sense when he signed his confession to write in Latin under duress, to make very, very clear that this was not freely given and freely stated. And, I know some Hungarian Catholics, not many, but a few, who think he was not obedient enough to the Holy Father in the 70s, but frankly, he was not going to obey Cardinal Casaroli and the Holy Father when they were doing Kadar's bidding. I think he thought he had a high, as Prince Primate, as leader of the Hungarian Church, he had a mission to truth and faith and country that just could not be abandoned, that a fundamentalist view of obedience would make him complicit in the servitude of the church. So I would say if you read the memoirs, you'll see all those virtues on display, a certain indomitability of spirit, and a deep attachment to family. His mother visited him in prison between 48 and 56. She and two of his sisters were allowed to visit him in the American legation. And he was deeply, deeply wounded when his mother really looked like a peasant woman, all wrapped up in all of this. But one thing I did learn when I was in Budapest in April was that there's this book in English, still in print, called The World's Most Orphan Nation. So a lot of Mindszenti's speeches in the 40s and 50s, and then a couple of things he wrote in the legation. And we always wondered, how did that get to Germany? And then well, it was carried out by his mother on her last visit. For some reason, she had all these robes around her, like a Hungarian peasant woman. She stuck it really in there. And they never searched her. They searched the sisters. And she was quite willing to play her role in sneaking this book out of the American legation so Cardinal Mindszenty could continue to speak to the world. I just learned that in April, and it made me smile. I heard this from András Deák, a former Hungarian diplomat and Mindszenty scholar. I also heard it from his nephew Carlo, his 91 Mindszenty's brothers. He was so great to me because he very close to Mindszenty and very much a member of the family, but he lived for a while in New Jersey. And so imagine Cardinal Mindszenty meets New Jersey. That's Carlo, the 90-year-old nephew. But yeah.
You said at one point that the Cardinal had spoken out against Nazi Germany and Nazism. And he's one of the few people that I know of historically as a leader who recognized the overlap of communism and nationalsocialism, so Nazism.
Oh.
And he was right in making that comparison. And I wonder if you can elucidate a little bit what he might have thought about the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which publicly confirmed that overlap, and what you might have thought about what happened later, when at Nuremberg, one group was identified as war criminals and as totalitarians, and another group was largely excused. We have another group of totalitarians in Japan, but in any case, the Cardinal seems to have understood that totalitarianism was the nature.
Sure. There are 80 documents that end the memoirs. Some of them are quite fascinating. Mindszenty had done very detailed studies of church-state relations in Bolshevik Russia. And even, we sometimes underestimate how brutally suppressed the Orthodox Church was. There were very many heroic figures like Patriarch Tikhon at the beginning of the regime, but 85,000 Russian Orthodox nuns and priests were killed in the 30s. There were, so the collaborationist church we remember from the 50s and 60s is a church that had been beaten down over many decades. But in that particular document, one of the 80 documents in the memoirs, Mindszenty's whole point is that there cannot be real cooperation that between the Christian church and communism, nor can there be any kind of cooperation between the Christian church and Nazism because of its incendiary and murderous racialism. What's really interesting, the Hitler-Stalin Pact would not have surprised him at all. I think he belonged to a camp that, there were the brown totalitarians and there were the red totalitarians, and he, a plague on both their houses. But his first speeches denouncing the Arrow Cross and as incompatible with Christianity, that this isn't patriotism, this is homicidal aversion to whole peoples and nations. As Marquis Bello points out, those date from 1937, 7 years before the Arrow Cross under Ferenc Szalasi becomes the ruling government. Well, I think the Nazis were the ruling government, that the Arrow Cross were their instruments. So, yes, for him, there was no, he wasn't one of these anti-communists who thought, well, the Nazis really aren't so bad because they're anti-communists. He had none of that. And there's a consistency and purity to his moral rejection of totalitarianism. And I have never sensed in him any, he'll often just refer to the Russians when he means the Soviets, but I have never sensed in him any undue hostility to the Russian people. He saw the Russians, Ukrainians, and others as victims of communist ideology. And he certainly writes with sympathy for the sufferings of the Orthodox Church. So, but those 80 documents are really good. And they've got he got a lot of the addresses and speeches he gave when he came to the West, and some of his letter to the Holy See. If you want to be a Mindszenty fanatic, there are 2 volumes available in English. One is called, one is a Do Not Forget This Small, Honest Nation. These are his correspondence with American presidents and Secretary of State between 56 and 71. I should say it's not really, he wrote the letters. I think he got a letter from Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Nixon. He got 3 back. But if you want to know his thinking while he's in the legation, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters. And they all really come back to he is going to speak for Hungary in this moment of enslavement. The second volume is a collection, very big too, of his correspondence with the Holy See. And there are more responses from their end. But you can see that they're thinking very different things. The church, Casaroli, wants a permanent accommodation with the East. Mindszenty wants to hold out until the specter of Bolshevism is overcome. And Casseroli was not sympathetic to Marxism. He just thought he was Metternich, like Kissinger. But some of the people in the Vatican Secretary of State had an ideological preference for communism. Not exactly communist, but they were the progressive party. And they liked the peace briefs and all of that. And so those are two 800 page volumes where if you can kind of deepen the story. But I encourage you, only if you're a fanatic like me, you would buy those volumes or a scholar, but do buy the memoirs. They are moving and affecting. They're not expensive. $22, I think, for a 500-page book. So those are good prices, by the way. And there's also several copies of a book by myself. I introduced the memoirs. Joseph Pierce, the great Catholic apologist, has written on Shakespeare and Tolkien and Solzhenitsyn and C.S. Lewis. Has a wonderful little book on Pope Benedict. He wrote the foreword, and then there's a book of mine called The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity. The argument is that what we've been talking about, that increasingly the Christian religion has been reinterpreted to be a political religion promoting revolutionary transformation, or simply a religion that aims to promote humanitarian values without much reference to Jesus or God. And I draw on a whole series of figures, including Pope Benedict XVI, Vladimir Soloviev, and I have a delicate critique of some of the encyclicals of the present Holy Roman Pontiff, the one who thinks Fidel was an environmentalist. But anyway, that's called The Idol of Our Age. So those two books are available for sale. Kevin Jones, who runs the bookstore at our co-sponsor, the Catholic Information Center. And I will be, since Cardinal Mindszenty isn't with us, his 90-year-old nephew is in Budapest. So I will, as the author of the principal introduction, I will be happy to sign the book.
All right, let's take one last question from the gentleman on the front row next to Dr. Spalding.
Two questions, just one's very brief. First one is that terrorism, can that be enjoyed in English? And number two, more controversial question. I know Mindszenty opposed to communism. Did he also oppose the right-wing fascist governments in Spain, Portugal, and South America in the 70s as well? Say for similar reason, or was he just against communism? Thanks.
Yeah. I don't think Salazar's government or Franco's governments in the 70s were fascist. I think Franco is the fascists or phalangists supported Franco's cause in the Civil War, but by the late 1950s, early 60s, Spain was being run by these technocrats from Opus Dei, and Raymond Aron, the great French conservative, liberal, anti-totalitarian thinker, said when he lectured at the University of Madrid in 1973, he never saw a university so dominated by militant Marxists. So Spain made a very quick transition from Franco to constitutionalism, 75 to 77, 78. No, he did not denounce it, and it did not denounce the Franco regime. And Salazar was always anti-Nazi. He was a Catholic economist. These regimes were run-of-the-mill authoritarian regimes, especially Salazar. I'd compare it to Horthy in Hungary in the 1930s and 40s. A lot better than both National Socialism and communism. I think Mindszenty did go to Portugal once to visit Fatima, if I'm not mistaken. But no, he would not. I think by 75, he was more worried that the communists were going to take over in Spain and Portugal, and they were going to end up with something even worse. So, but no. But where he did criticize things closer to home, he was among the most vocal Catholic critics of both National Socialism and the homegrown Arrow Cross. There was a very pagan, militaristic cult of war around the Arrow Cross, and Mindszenty saw in it, what did Herodotus say? That no sane man prefers war to peace. In other words, you fight wars to protect what Augustine called the tranquilitas ordinus, to protect a civilized order. But perpetual war, lupine imperialism, is really not compatible with civilization. So Mindszenty saw that in the Arrow Cross and the Nazis. And when he studied Alfred Rosenberg's racial writings, he was just appalled by how stupid they were. And Hitler didn't exactly look like the Nietzsche's blonde beast.
So, is that can be done in English?
What's that?
Museum of Terror and Hunger, can that be enjoyed in English?
Can what be enjoyed in English?
When you go to the exhibits.
Oh, when you go to the house, I didn't understand your first question. When you go to the House of Terror, first of all, each of the rooms, and there are many, many of them, have cards in French, Italian, English, and Hungarian, where you get a very detailed account of what's at stake or what's going on in each of those exhibits. But you can also rent headphones in 7 or 8 languages for, I think, 22 euros. You don't want to say it in Florence because it's just like foreigns. The foreigns are, you think it's 70 billion and, it's you're buying an ice cream cone, I'm woefully exaggerating, but not much. But the House of Terror is something else. And they also publish a beautiful book in several languages. I saw them in French, Italian, English, and Hungarian that summarizes the museum with wonderful headings, discussion, pictures, testimonies. It's exceeded. How many people here have been to the House of Terror? Do you guys agree with my evaluation that it's very well done?
Second only to the Victims of Communism.
Sure.
I would say that this museum is very much in the educative model of the House of Terror. And also what animates both enterprises is the sense that something important, contemporary, and enduring is at stake.
Mm-hmm.
This is not something from the past, but unless we teach the young people what was at stake and remains at stake in the totalitarian episode, then we really are bound to repeat it. I have a new book under contract called The Persistence of the Ideological Lie. And my argument is our failure to really come to terms with the meaning of the communist episode has meant these new ideological movements that attack people on the basis of who they are and not what they do, that cast whole groups of people as racial and class enemies and all of this, silence them, won't let them speak at all. This is the same ideological Manichaeanism you saw in 20th century totalitarianism. So we really failed miserably. We need VOC, museum, Memorial Foundation. We need the House of Terror. And these are long-term operations. This is not just illustrating the past. This is illustrating a terrible, demonic temptation within our civilization.
All right. Yeah. Dan, I want to personally, thank you for, no pun intended, for the introduction to the man. I mean, your introduction pushed me over to Article 82, and I read that radio address, and I think, here's a guy that just came out of 8 years of prison, and to have an opportunity to vent, he took an opposite approach. He used it as an educational.
I'll tell you a story there. By 1953, he had lost half his weight. And
Mhm.
then when Naj comes back, they started feeding him again. And so when he was released at the time of revolution, he didn't look bad, but 2 or 3 years before, he could barely walk. And yet that picture on the cover of the book, if anyone has it, want to hold it up? That's a picture of him addressing the press on November 1st, 1956. And you could see his dignity. And I love something he says. He's reflecting on Dostoevsky's prison writings. And he says in the memoirs, a man can remain good and even great in prison. And that's what Mindszenty did. So, thank you.
All right.